All right, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Peggy Shannon-Baker. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I'm an associate professor of educational research in the College of Education at Georgia Southern University. This is the second of 3 lunch and learn sessions that I'm hosting this summer on research and inquiry. Last week, I did a session on tech tools for doctoral students. And if you missed that session and are interested, if you go to that link on the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a link to the recording of last week's session. In this week's session, I want to talk about the research purpose, questions, and your methods. And the reason why we're talking about all 3 things today is because the aim for a good study, like a rigorous study, hopefully all of your dissertations will embody this, is what's called methodological congruence. This is when all 3 of those things, the research purpose, your research questions, and your methods align conceptually and rhetorically, as in like the word choice that you have. So how do we get to methodological congruence? That's what I'm going to help you with today during the session. So I'm going to look at the difference between a research purpose and the research significance. I find sometimes people confuse the 2, but they actually have 2 different goals for your research. So I'll talk about those differences. I will also talk about the features of good research questions and how the research questions can actually signal what your methods are going to be. Or sometimes you can use how you're framing your research question to tell you what kinds of methods you might be interested in. So it can be a back and forth relationship, and we'll go through that. I'm going to be showing you a number of different examples. Again, you'll be able to access these in the PDF of the slides or in the a recording of this session, so don't feel stressed about needing to keep down everything. It's also important, and I'll state this a couple of times throughout the session today, that all of this is presented based on my own experiences, so my own training and different kinds of research methods, as well as how I teach and train doctoral students. So this is not, a Bible of these elements, the purpose, the questions, and the methods, but these are my recommendations, and this is how I mentor doctoral students in these 3 things. So first, let's get into the research purpose. This is really like the first piece when I start to work with a doctoral student who is putting together their pre-prospectus. I have them frame their research purpose first so that I can help them think through the elements of this. As I'm going through this, let me also ask for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. It would be helpful for me to know your name, which program you're in for the doctoral programs, and what stage in the program you're at, because I'm going to speak to different kinds of stages, but I would love to know who's in the room. So if you can add that in the chat, that would be helpful. So your research purpose, this is when you are distinguishing the content of your study. What is your study about, and who is your study about? It's really going to answer those 2 pieces, the what is your study about and the who is your study about. So let's talk about the difference between your research purpose and your significance. I can see some introductions coming into the chat. Good to see some familiar names coming in here. People coming in from different stages. I'm seeing some folks in coursework, some folks at the pre-prospectus, some folks at the prospectus. This is great. Keep the introductions coming. So the research purpose, I like to think of this as a balance between broad framing and narrow or specific language. So broad in the sense of it's not a hypothesis, so you're not identifying specifically what you're testing, But it does need to be specific enough in terms of your language, because the words that you use in your purpose they carry a lot of weight. So the purpose is going to be specific to your own study, looking at the what and the who. What is your study about, and who is your study about? It may include some of these typical sentence starters. So the most common one is, the purpose of this study is to blah, blah, blah. Now, it doesn't mean every time you see the word purpose, it's a purpose sentence, but it could be a purpose sentence, and often we'll use that. Sometimes researchers, you might see this in an article, might say something like, this study details, what happened between this and this, or this study will explore the following. These are different kinds of frames, but there's still some typical start language for the research purpose. All right. I love to see all of the folks in the room. We've got people from both EDD programs. That's great. So how does the research purpose differ from the research significance? The research significance is what speaks to the impact of your study. So it could be the impact for yourself as a person, or yourself as an educational professional. It could speak to the impact you want to have on participants or other educational professionals, maybe the impact on a research field. The research significance is going to speak to like the bigger picture of your work. So somebody says, okay, yeah, sure, your study's about this, so what? Like, why should we care? It starts to answer that so what question. Well, we should care because I want teachers to be doing this. I want higher education professionals to do this. I want principals to learn about this. That would be the research significance. You might see something like modal verbs like, this study can showcase, or as a result of this study, educational professionals should do this. You might see phrasing like that. Otherwise, sometimes the significance is not clearly signaled like that unless there's a heading that says significance. Most of you in your pre-prospectus or your prospectus is the first 3 chapters usually. Usually you will have a section where you speak to the significance somewhere in those. Let's talk through some examples. So I have 2 different examples. Hopefully they will speak to, one or both will speak to your interest or your program. So the first one comes from Fox and colleagues. They conducted a quantitative study on the relationship between authentic leadership and principles and teachers' trust in those principles. So they were interested in looking at whether or not trust was mediated through either feeling like personally identifying with the principal or identifying with the culture of the school or the school as an organization. So they did a quantitative study. I have some info on the methods here. They set up different hypotheses. I'll have the reference at the end if you want to look at it. And they found that feeling personally identified with the principal was a mediator for whether or not they felt a sense of trust, but feeling like they identified with the school was not a mediator. What I want to do now, and I'll do this with the second example as well, I'm showing you parts of the introduction to this article. So I've cut and pasted some pieces of the introduction. And what I want you to do now is take a moment to read through this introduction and see if you can identify the sentence where they introduce their purpose. And just keep it to yourself. Don't put it in the chat if you're a fast reader. So take a moment to read and see if you can find the purpose sentence here. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to either read through or skim through these different paragraphs from the introduction of this article. Now, what I want to point out are some features I'm not really discussing at length in this session, but just to help you see what kinds of things you would find in an introduction. What I've done now is I've shown a couple of orange underlining for parts of the introduction that identified the context. So the context or the background is where you're presenting what might be already known in the research on your topic, what the current social context is, like this paragraph on the upper right-hand side that starts nearly all education reform reports conclude this. It's kind of like a summary of both the research and what they're saying in 2015, the current context was for this topic. And what I'm now showing you is a blue underlining for the part of the paragraph that starts, therefore, the purpose of the current research was to explore, and then it kind of continues on. By a show of reactions, is this the purpose sentence that you identified when you read through? The nice thing about this particular example is that it does use the purpose of this study is too, right? So hopefully you were able to identify this particular sentence because I've shared with you that this is common language that we use to signal the purpose. Now, they don't have what might also be in an introduction, like the research questions, but their purpose paragraph really is pretty detailed. So we do have a sense of what they're investigating. Let's take a look now at the second example. If you've recently joined, please introduce yourself with your name, what program you're in, and what stage of the doctoral program you're at, so I know. Now we're going to look at a second example. This one comes from Paul Gorski, and he studied the perceptions of support and learning needs among teachers who teach multicultural education. So this is based in teacher education programs and the teachers who teach about multicultural ed. This is a qualitative example. So I have some information here on the methods for this example. And he found that faculty identified some of these specific things that they needed. So they needed identity-specific content knowledge. They needed pedagogical strategies to teach these courses, and they needed support networks among other teacher educators. Just like with the first example, I want you to take a moment now to try to skim through these 3 paragraphs on the screen or on the PDF and see if you can identify where the research purpose is. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to read or skim through most of the 3 paragraphs that are on the screen or in the PDF copy of the slides. I apologize for the text overlay, but maybe that's a signal that that small part is not the purpose, right? Okay, so let me show you what kinds of things we're seeing in this introduction to this article. Just like with the previous example, I'm showing you now some orange underlining for some elements of the introduction that are the context or the background. Now, Gorski is taking like a very research-heavy approach to setting the context. You can tell because of the number of citations he used versus the Fox example from earlier. So he's basing it in the research that's been done about pre-service teacher education and how we're missing research about multicultural teacher education in particular. What's interesting about this example, and now I'm showing you a blue underlining for the second paragraph that starts, in order to begin to uncover what people who teach multicultural teacher education courses perceive as their support and learning needs, I conducted and analyzed data from, et cetera, et cetera. This sentence and much of this paragraph is the research purpose. So by show of reactions, is this what you identified as the purpose, or yes or no? What's interesting about this example is that he did not use that common language that I mentioned. The purpose of this study is to. He used one of the other approaches, which is saying, I examined this, I analyzed data about this. So he didn't use the word purpose, but he was speaking to the what and the who of the study. What you do also see in this example, to show you another orange underlining for the third paragraph, he identified his research question here. My research question was : and then he lists it directly. Another kind of tip to reading journal articles, for example, if you read the research question, you've either already passed the research purpose, or they didn't give a research purpose, they're giving you the question instead. So if you read down that far and you hadn't noticed the purpose yet, you could go up to see if they have it up earlier. Usually the organization is purpose and then research questions. So this was an example showing you a different kind of approach to introducing the purpose. What I want to do now is another kind of low-key test. It's not a real test because I'm not grading you, and it's going to be anonymous, but I've set up a poll to ask you your perspective on these three statements. Is it identifying the purpose, the what and the who of the study, or is it identifying the research significance, which identifies the impact of the study? So take a moment. You should see a pop-up for poll questions, 3 questions, to see is number 1, number 2, or number 3 a research purpose or a research significance. And since there's 2 options but 3 questions, at least 2 of them might be repeating the same option. So let's see what you say. Okay, so I see we have 2 more folks, 1 more person who needs to respond. I'll just kind of talk through how I came up with these first. Okay, and then I will release the polls. So these 3 purposes are from my imagination. I didn't come up with these in any particular way, but I did try to come up with some language that I have seen in my own work with doctoral students. So let's talk through the results of this poll here. So number 1, in this study, I aim to explore elementary teachers' use of culturally sustaining pedagogy. Is this a research purpose or a research significance? Most of you answered correctly, which is it is a research purpose. What you should see on the slides here is some of my rationale behind why this is a purpose rather than a significance. So it identifies the what of your topic, which would be culturally sustaining pedagogy. And it identifies the who, the teachers that they collected data from, or they will collect data from. It doesn't use the purpose, but it uses that framing like we did with the second example. This is something I could see in a purpose section for like a dissertation, prospectus, or pre-prospectus. Number 2, this one is a little bit trickier. The purpose of this study is to encourage educational leaders to consider SEL, that's social emotional learning, in their leadership practices. This one is an example of the kinds of language I see in a purpose, but it's speaking to not the content of what you study, but the impact that you wanted your study to have. If you're speaking to the impact, that makes it a significant statement rather than a purpose statement. So the impact they want to have is they want ed leaders to engage with social emotional learning. They want them to take that into account. It isn't necessarily what they studied. Did they look at how leaders do this already? Did they look at what is the nature of SEL at the leadership level? We don't really know. We know what they want the impact of their study to be from this, so that's why it's a significance. The last example, this study examined how the community organization ABC Forward impacted youth's hope. I don't know if this organization existed. I just came up with the name off the top of my head. This is an example of the research purpose. Now, you might be confused because I use the word impact here, but they're not saying they want the impact to happen. They're studying the impact in this example. So this one is another tricky example. They are looking at the what, the impact of this organization with youth and youth's hope. That would be another what here. So this is a tricky example because it's studying the impact of something. Many of your studies might be around educational interventions or things that you might not call an educational intervention, but you want to investigate if there's an impact. That can still be the purpose statement. You just have to be careful to differentiate the impact of your own research versus studying the impact of something. So let's move on now to the research questions. Your research questions, we kind of saw some examples, one example of those research questions in the Gorski example earlier. Your research questions get into the guidelines for the study, whereas the purpose really outlines the content, the who and the what of your study. For this, I wanted to start us with thinking about how crucial your phrasing is in a research question. So I framed this imaginary research question here. What are professional students' perceptions about faculty use of culturally responsive pedagogy in their doctoral programs? What are their perceptions about this kind of instructional practice? So each phrase that you have in your research question becomes really important in terms of your methods. And I'm going to show you really how important it becomes. Because with each of these rows, we're going to see what the phrasing signals. So the first thing that I noticed as a reader of research, as a mentor of research, I noticed this is a what question, and it's exploratory. We want to know about the nature of these perceptions, so it's kind of broad. I noticed that the participants are in this first framing here. You're interested in professional students' perceptions. And generally speaking, if you're interested in perceptions, that phrase or that word often is aligned with qualitative approaches, although it doesn't have to always be the case, but it implies that you're maybe using qualitative research. The faculty's use gives us some more signals. So another key concept that we're interested in is culturally responsive pedagogy at the higher education level. So that's really like all three next rows here. But it tells me that we need some data either about what faculty actually do, so some kind of objective observation or their own self-reporting, as well as some kind of data that collects students' perceptions about what they're doing, what faculty are doing. The key concept of culturally responsive pedagogy is here. And we need to be able to, in our study, define what is culturally responsive pedagogy and how we know it when we see it. And then we also have this key context of how are they doing it in doctoral programs. I might also ask other questions of like all kinds of doctoral programs or like educational doctorate programs. And we need to make sure that our data is going to come from doctoral programs of some kind. Notice how I can read into all of these different phrases for a research question. This is why when you craft your research questions, you have to think about what does each phrase and each set of phrases mean, and what are those implications of those phrases for your study. Good research questions are questions that you ask yourself. These are not questions usually that you ask directly of your participants. Like, what do you think about this? What do you think about? Yeah, that is correct, Miranda, thanks. What do you think about this? The questions that you would ask your participants are usually data collection questions. The question you ask yourself that you want to explore in your study is the research question. Now, your research question is hopefully something that can be answered or in some way addressed in your study. You don't want to have such a broad question that it's almost unanswerable. Excuse me. Notice that I pointed out with the example how the research question will show you the key concepts and the key people, just like your purpose does. There is going to be some phrasing overlap, maybe more than others. For some studies, you'll see some overlap and reuse of your language between the purpose and the questions. And I'll talk about different kinds of questions here in a little bit, but that if you feel like you're repeating yourself, that's okay, because sometimes the research purpose and the questions use very similar language. And you notice when I broke down the pieces of that one question, it's going to tell us about your methods. Now, I say it's going to tell us about your methodology, your design, and your methods. So it would be helpful for me to describe what are the differences between these things, just in case you're not familiar. Methodology is the broadest concentric circle. Inside it is design, and inside it is method. Think of it as most broad to getting most specific. To give you an example, qualitative research is a methodology. A methodology is like a broad framework for how you think about and how you do research. What is considered good research? What are rigorous methods? Things like that. Qualitative research, quantitative research, mixed methods, action research, these are all examples of methodology. Design is more often than not affiliated with a specific methodology. Designs are a more specific frame for how you're going to do your study. So I gave the example of ethnography. It is a type of qualitative research where there are some common expectations about what kind of data you're collecting, how you're interacting with participants, how you're analyzing and representing your data. Methods then are the very specific practices or procedures you use in your study. So a method would be like an interview, a focus group, a structured observation, a survey, a questionnaire, things like that. The data that you collect, how you collect it, and how you analyze it, those are your research methods. To get back to the research questions, I want to connect the research question language to methods. So there's some old school thinking that you might have, or some of your advisors might have, like, if you see the word impact, what is the impact of this in a question? It has to be quantitative research. Sometimes people believe if you see the word relationship, it requires you to use this particular statistical test, the Pearson's correlation. And some people believe that quantitative research only uses hypotheses, it doesn't use questions. This is more outdated thinking than what we actually see now in terms of, most of these are around quantitative research. Now we can see you can measure, like that ABC forward example, where you want to look at the impact an organization is having. You can measure that impact in any number of ways. It doesn't have to be through quantitative methods. I am doing research with a nonprofit, and we look at impact, and we use mixed methods. So we use quant and qual. I'm going to skip ahead so that we can get into some of the questions here. What I want to show you now are some of the differences in terms of how you frame questions across 3 common methodologies. Now, these are guidelines. These are not strict rules, right? So just because I say it doesn't mean it always has to be the case. These are common instances, but these aren't hard and fast rules. So qualitative research often investigates how or why questions. It could also investigate what questions, exploratory questions. They are often interested in naming the participants or the perspectives inside the questions, teachers' perceptions of, what are educational, what are principles, practices. They want to name the people in the question. And qualitative research often starts with one broad question that's based on the purpose, and then specific questions underneath it that show us what angles to that question they're especially interested in. So if we have that broad question about how do we apply culturally sustaining pedagogy, I could have a sub question around how do they do it in the curriculum, how do they do it in assessment, and how do they do it in interactions with students. That would be 3 sub questions to make it more specific. In quantitative research, we might also see how questions, as in relationship-oriented questions. We might see what questions. Now, this is based on quantitative research that's more exploratory than hypothesis-driven. The quantitative questions will identify variables that they want to look at, and they're interested in identifying those variables. And they might, if they have like a really broad question, sub questions would say, I want to look at the relationship between these, the relationship between these, and the relationship between these variables. If you are interested in doing mixed methods research, think of this as both qual and quant and another one. So mixed methods research questions follow the same norms as quantitative and qualitative questions. You need to have one question per approach, because mixed methods is when you combine 2 or more methodologies together. So if I'm doing qual and quant together, I need a qualitative question and I need a quantitative question. And for mixed methods, I need a third question where I identify what I'm interested in mixing or interfacing the 2 together. So there's usually not a broad question with specific questions. Instead, you want one question per approach, 1 qual, 1 quant, and 1 mixed. What I'm going to show us now are some examples of question phrasing and how they signal potential kinds of designs. And I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because there are many different examples. And I'm just giving you one example of what's possible. You could apply other kinds of designs with these specific questions. So for example, if you have a research question like this one, the 4th one here, that's very specific in a Title I rural Georgia school, it's identifying a very specific context. So you could frame it as a case study because it's so specific. This next one, I'm interested in studying something among queer Black educators. The reason why I identified this as possibly a counter-narrative approach is because how often does research center their voices? Counter-narrative inquiry is interested in centering voices of people of color and other folks that we don't often hear. So maybe this study could use counter-narrative inquiry. I want to show us some examples of quantitative phrasing and how those could connect to quantitative designs. So for instance, you could study perceptions with a quantitative study, something that's really exploratory. There's no hypothesis necessarily. You just want to look at what are their attitudes towards something. If you made it quantitative, you would need to create some kind of survey or questionnaire that's descriptive to collect data about their attitudes, or maybe you want to use some kind of scale that already exists. You might be interested in changes after some kind of intervention, and this might entail a longitudinal quantitative design. Usually longitudinal is combined with other kinds of designs because it just tells us you're collecting data over time, but not what kinds of relationships you're looking at. That's what these other kinds of designs are telling us, how you're messing with the variables, let's say. And then the same thing applies to mixed method studies as well. Mixed methods has its own set of design types based on how you're interfacing the two approaches. So if you want to collect qualitative data and quantitative data separately and then analyze them separately and then compare them, we use what's called a convergent design. So you might frame your question, how do the data compare between the surveys and the interviews about, teachers' perceptions of principals, for example. Some of these designs that I've named here, you might not know about, but that's okay. You can always go and look up these design type names to see what they're all about, or you can talk to me, offline. And mixed methods, to make it more complex, right? Because we need to make things more difficult. Mixed methods can also combine designs with other types. So like if you wanted to study, yeah, thanks for the emoji there, the laughing face. You could do a mixed methods case study. So you could do a mixed methods study in that Title I rural Georgia school. And then you would apply what we know about case studies from mostly qualitative side to the mixed methods side. And you kind of combine those two sets of frameworks to help us think through them. So I'm getting close to the question and answer. So I hope you're thinking of some. The goal for today was to talk about methodological congruence and how we can get there. Hopefully, I've demonstrated how your research purpose and your questions can rhetorically align, conceptually align, and signal the methods that your study might use. So we've talked about the differences between the purpose and the research significance. We've looked at features of good research questions and examples of questions, as well as purposes versus significance. And I've kind of done a whirlwind tour of how your questions can more directly signal what kinds of methods you're interested in using. Or if you're thinking of a question in this way, it might say, hey, you should check out this kind of methodological approach. So we have made it to the question and answer session. So I'm going to stop the recording so we can get into that.